Darren Colomb, welcome to the stage.
Okay, cool. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be speaking at the homecoming again. I always love homecoming time. It's great conversations and really late nights. But it's good fun, and it's good to meet so many like-minded people and people who are so interested in the science that I concern myself with on a daily basis. So it's a real honor and a privilege. This talk in particular is important to me. I wanted to cover some of the finer details of atomic structure at my Tesla Tech conference in 2017, but I had such a short amount of time and there's so much material to cover, I didn't really get to hit on some of the points that I wanted to. So this talk has kind of been a long time coming, and it's been a long time in my mind as to how I would present this material and make it maybe a little easier to understand. This book right here, Atomic Suicide, is sort of the source of a lot of the material that I'm going to cover. So if you don't have this book, I highly recommend it. It's well worth the money. Just in the descriptions of gravity and magnetism alone make it extremely valuable. And also, if you are concerned with the use of atomic energy on our planet right now, it's good to get yourself educated on what's really going on there with that book. So this was the first slide of my my talk from 2017, but I really like how this is phrased and written. This university is 100% about awakening the divine spark in man's spiritual nature. That's the only way we're going to have a united and enduring civilization. By giving this knowledge out, that's the way we're going to aid people in their own personal transformation to the highest aspiration that an individual wants to achieve. That is really what this is all about. This building is erected for that very purpose, and it's a beautiful testament to that. So this is what I'm going to cover, just a brief outline. Basically, the whole crux of this is I'm going to be looking at modern science's views of atomic structure versus what Russell tells us is a better description of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So we're going to look at the accepted model right now. We're going to look at how Russell's model is different or similar, but mostly different. Deconstructing the material nucleus, that's where atomic suicide, there's a chapter in here called the material nucleus, and it's basically Walter's way of deconstructing the material nucleus concept. So we'll get into that. We're going to look at, is there anything in the scientific data that's out there that already exists to prove some of the things that Russell's saying his model is different than the other accepted models. We're going to look at the quantum theory just a little bit. We're going to look at particle wave duality, and we're going to look into chemistry a little bit deeper, things like valence and atomic bonding, things that aren't necessarily addressed directly from Walter, but things that I've been able to figure out. And then what I want to drive home is that really this is an optical universe rather than an electromagnetic one. And I think that is such an important thing because, and I'll show you some experiments I've done. I always try to hit it home with real world practical experiments that show what I call that magnetism as a force doesn't really exist. What the whole situation with magnets and magnetism is really optics, because this is an optical universe. It's all light, and light is the only thing that we have to deal with. And so magnetism and electricity and things are kind of identities that aren't really what they are. They've been given a name that is a misnomer. So we're going to start with, I'm sure everybody recognizes this. This is what you get if you go to school right now. It's the Bohr-Rutherford model, as it's called. But what I like about the Russells, and this image comes from the home study course, third edition. And what the Russells say about this is when they titled the figure was, this is the atomic structure misconcept, which I thought is kind of funny. But basically, this model says that there are three types of charged particles with single charges. The nucleus contains, here in the middle, the protons, which are the positively charged, and the neutrons, which somehow have no charge. The outer orbitals here are in multi-section planes, electron shells, which are the negative charge. That's the model as it stands. But let's ask some questions about this and think about it a little bit. Can anything exist with just a single charge? Can anything really exist that is just purely positive or purely negative or neutrally charged, which is neither one? So can a neutrally charged particle really even exist in our universe? Or would anything that is created as matter have some kind of charge rather than a neutral charge or no charge? Can there be such a thing as a negative charge? And I've talked a lot about this in my prior conference lectures. I always drive this home that negative charge is actually kind of like a double negative. It cancels each other out because to charge is to add to. Negative is subtracting, and so negative charge is kind of like saying adding by subtracting, which means you're not really saying anything at all. So again, it comes back to, can anything really have just a single charge on it, whether it's negative or positive? Do we see any evidence in nature that particles just jump from one orbital path to another orbital path? Is there any evidence or anything that we see in nature that actually does that? Because the theory says that electrons jump from one orbital shell to another, and I don't know about you, but I've never seen the planets or comets or anything do that. Here's another interesting question. If like charges repel, which is the principle of the Coulomb law, how does the nucleus, which is composed of positively charged protons, hold itself together? Because those protons you see here are packed really tight in the nucleus. And I don't know if you've ever tried pushing bar magnets together, but they repel if you get similar poles. So if you have similar charges in the nucleus, how can that be held together? They would repel. And so in physics, they invent all these forces, the nuclear forces, strong and weak nuclear forces, to account for this pretty big hole in the theory. And I say hole as kind of a joke because we're going to see that the center of the nucleus is actually a vacuum, and there's nothing there. So, and I do want to point out, this is the Russell's redefinition of a dipole. There are two positive charges, male and female, extended from one central equator. Or you can think of this as equilibrium, or I always refer to the bar magnet, the so-called block wall, being the magnetic light of God, which Walter said was a way of proving God's existence in a laboratory using magnetics. And I think that's an extremely significant tip that he gave us to understand what light actually is. So the Rutherford Bohr model was proposed in 1913. It basically says atoms are like our solar system, but we replace gravity with the electrostatic forces as if they're something different entirely, but they give you the same net result or the same structure of a solar system on the atomic level. And really the only way to advance this theory as it stands is with quantum theory, which is to kind of say, what I'm trying to make a point here is that it's a theory to begin with, and the only way to advance that theory is to create more theory in sort of a never-ending cascade of just postulates. And when we're looking at Russell's work, we need to understand the differences between things that are self-evident truths, things that are maybe true, but they're not quite self-evident to everybody, versus a postulate, which is really just a guess, an educated guess. And also that theory, when we're dealing with theory in physics, we're really dealing just with polemics, which is just sort of like argument for the sake of argument. I think my theory is right, I think your theory is wrong, so on and so forth. And in reality, it's like we're missing the point altogether. We need to get to these things, which are the self-evident truths, the things that we can prove to ourselves in our own experiences. So we're going to look at Russell's concept of what particles are, because I'm going to cover particle-wave duality, but I can tell you just sort of upfront that it's all waves. But Walter uses this word particle here, and I think he did that to kind of bridge the gap between the people who are so fixed in a particle-based universe that they need to have something similar in their mind with which they can, bridge the concept. So he has this drawing in Atomic Suicide that shows, the ultimate particles of the universe are actually just rings around vacuum. Or put another way, spinning electrical potential vortex around a point of rest, or I can say mind. If you've all studied Walter's work, you'll know that that point of gravity area of rest there is really mind in every sense. It's your mind, my mind, everybody's mind, the collective mind, God's mind. And only when we have this spinning around this point do we have a separation of an inside to an outside. And my background is biology, so to me it's just like this functions just exactly like the membrane of a cell, except we're going deeper now past the cell level into the atomic level, and you could go even smaller. This is essentially happening on all size scales. It's a unified structure on all scales. But we're focusing predominantly on the atomic level for this talk. So the entire universe of matter is basically a multiplicity of these little whirling gyroscopic rings. There's nothing else in the universe. So think about that. So atoms are rings with holes in them, and they're caused by wave interferences. This is really important because, again, this gets back to simply optics. When we have waves colliding with other waves, we generate interference patterns. And those interference patterns are basically pressure-locked potentials in Walter's lingo. And those are the different elements. And so we're going to look really in depth into the structure behind Walter's atoms. So the only spheres in nature that occur are amplitude elements. The best example is carbon, because it's completely bisexual. It's equally male and female via the hemispheres, and I'm going to show you some drawings that depict that. But its prototype is a flaming carbon sun, which centers all of our solar systems in various time scales. And even these spheres are composed of 4 pairs of light rings, and I'll show you that interior structure with some drawings. They have to synchronize with the light spectrum. So in other words, we have a red end and a blue end, but we have to create double yellow centered by white to create a sun. So we'll look at how the colors go with the atomic structure, because I feel it's so important to understand, because it brings it back to, again, it's light and it's an optical universe. So we can understand atoms and atomic structure in the frame of light. I think we are more accurately describing the atom than the Rutherford-Bohr model does, or any other model that may be advanced currently today. So Walter's concept of the atom, we could say it's rings, we could say, as I did here, it's just spinning around a point of still mind. But there is a structure of the wave, as I said, and it's gyroscopic is the word that Walter chooses to describe this. It's like spinning. If you've ever spinned a top and watched it wobble, it has a gyroscopic precession. And this gyroscopic precession is really the only thing that separates an atom of fluorine, for example, from an atom of oxygen or nitrogen. carbon being 90 degrees, or the wave amplitude from the wave axis, puts it in the amplitude position of the wave, or the overtone. I was describing it earlier as the crest or the trough of the wave. But that's a really important point, because it's sort of like a reversal point. That's the maximum in density that you can achieve, is at the very tippy top of the wave. So these are like equators that Walter's showing us. And these unwind the sun. Let's see, once it's generated, then it unwinds into rings again. So it's rings compressing and then rings expanding to create what we recognize as systems, whether they're solar or atomic. He even calls it, atomic planetary systems, because it's really the same thing, isn't it? It's the same recursive structure at any size scale or any dimensionality. And it's always extended from the zero inert gas by winding spirally in a series of 4 tonal efforts, which are vortices, nested vortices, if I can say that. They're within one another, and they're all bounded by the cube. These become the true spheres at the wave amplitude, as I said. Acceleration and revolution winds the spheres, and acceleration of rotation unwinds them. So you can think of this as like Saturn spins faster on its axis because it's farther away from the sun than Mercury, for example, which spins very slow on its axis. So this is both integration and disintegration, life and death. These are the mechanics of the vortices behind it, and the structure overall of the waveform gives you the tonal elements. And I just love Russell's work. I mean, I fell in love with his chart the first time I saw it, because he was speaking about the elements as being musical tones. And as a musician, I just resonated with that so much. I just sort of said internally, like, yeah, that's the way it is. And it comes back again to that personal truth, that self-evident truth for yourself. So we're going to look into, I'm basically now going to just rip apart the Rutherford Bohr model. And I'm going to do this in 5 or 6 steps, so that by the end of this talk, you're going to be able to talk to a physicist or somebody and just completely turn that whole understanding of chemistry upside down. But it's good to question things, I think. So we're going to start with number 1. Walter points out that nature is bilateral. It is not radial. Now, some of you who've studied Walter's work really in depth, you'll notice that he uses the term radial universe in some of his earlier books, especially The Universal One and The Secret of Light. The best thing I can come up with is, in a discussion with Leo Russell, he probably figured out that radial wasn't quite the best way of describing the universe, that it was really bilateral, because bilateral implies sex division or polarity. And I think he figured out over years of fine-tuning the explanation of his cosmogony that some words worked better than others for actually communicating what it was that he learned in his 39-day illumination, which was, wordless. He had to invent words such as magnetic light and things like that, because there was no vocabulary to accurately describe light the way that he understood it really was. So all motion in a spherical mass, it spins around its gravity shaft in a parallel plane and not around a common center of gravity, which is supposedly controls the whole mass. That's basically the theory of Newtonian gravity, is that there's a point at the center of the Earth that attracts all matter that's on the standing on the surface. And that acceleration due to gravity is about 9.8 meters per second. But if we look into this, we can actually see that every plane, you can think of it this, it's like made of slices. Does everybody see that? If you slice a sphere into planes, you'll see that if you were to stack parallel ring units on top of each other, that you would form a sphere. And it's not that it rotates around one common point. It rotates only in the plane of the point of the ring equator that it's spinning on along its axis. So we're already starting to see that maybe some of the illusions of motion have confused the theorists, specifically Niels Bohr, that proposed, the Bohr model of the atom. He did not consider that, this is a bilateral, bisexual universe, not a radial one of straight lines inward and outward. So this is more. These are my own drawings, by the way. If they're a little bit crude, but sometimes when you're reading Walter's books, you just sort of say to yourself, man, I wish he had drawn something this way. And over years of studying, I just decided to keep a notebook and make little doodles in it when the inspiration came, or the impetus came of, hey, I want this clearer, or I want to wrap my head around this better, so I'm just going to draw it out. And so these are kind of my personal notes, and I've decided to do something special this year and sort of just share them and like put them out there as they are, because to me, this is like how I understand it, and I like to just share it with everybody so that there can be better comprehension of what's written in the books. So, as I said, it's a bilateral, so there's a red hemisphere and a blue hemisphere. And Leo Russell said this was true of our sun, that there was a red half of the spectrum in the northern hemisphere and the blue in the southern, or vice versa. But the point is it's the two coming together to create something new, the same way man and woman come together to create new life. So this multi-plane concept of the Bohr atom, you see these intersecting planes, this can't really happen because the red male can't really flip over, come down, and become in the blue in one orbit. And this is what the Rutherford Bohr says really, is that these electrons are spinning around this nucleus in eccentric orbits like this that cut the central equator. And Walter tells us, sorry, that can't ever happen. So that kind of kills it right there, but we're going to continue to kill it even more so that there's no question in anybody's mind that it's not right. So here's a gravity shaft. Again, I'm just showing you that the shaft is really the fulcrum, and the spinning around it at 90 degrees is the lever. And I think that's really important to understand, because this applies to electricity in the what's called the left-hand rule, or that you can place, if you have a current flowing in one direction, that at 90 degrees to it you have a magnetic field. That's what science says now, but Walter tells us that magnetic field in a loop around the conductor is actually a loop of force, was his term for it. So it's not really magnetic, it's actually the lever spinning around a still fulcrum. The gravity shaft does not move. In a conductive wire, it just sits there with the magnetic field spinning around it as the current flows. So this applies to systems as well. When you have a mass, nuclear mass in the middle with orbits around it, the closer you are in that orbit to the parallel shaft of your primary, then the slower you spin on the axis, and the faster you spin revolutions. And the inverse is true with the planets as they move outwards. So here I'm showing that, again, this is just a thought ring around a vacuous hole. But you can't create just this one effect alone. You also have to create simultaneously the equal opposite, which is that hole being filled by centripetal motion. And this is kind of what science doesn't really understand right now, is that they talk about black holes and things that are just vacuous holes, but they don't really understand how does matter wind up or generate or come out of empty space to fill that vacuous hole. So number two, we're just going to emphasize that rings only expand in their own planes. They don't expand radially. If they did, the planets would just get bigger and bigger and bigger in diameter in all radial directions. But I'll submit for your consideration the fact that Saturn is oblate, meaning the circumference of its equator is wider than the length from pole to pole. So it's sort of like if you took a perfect sphere and sort of squished it in between your hands, it would bulge at the equator, as you see here, and shorten along its polar axis. And this is how rings expand. They expand out in planes, not radially. So if it were to expand radially, it would just be a larger and larger and larger sphere, and nothing would ever flatten back into a disk. But we see in nature all the time that things are in fact flattening into a disk as they dissolve back into the zero from which they sprang. So the fact that they oblate really proves that the rings expand in their own plane and not radially. If it did, like I said, it would still be a sphere, no matter how big it was. But you can see throughout, space and everything that the planets and suns expand in the plane which, parallel their equator. So here I'm showing that Walter explains it like if you were to drop a stone, there are only 3 places on the earth where if you dropped it, it would fall in a straight line. Every other place that you dropped it would curve because of the lines and the planes of electrical pressure curve in each hemisphere. So if you were to drop it right at the pole, it would fall straight down. If you were to drop it at the other pole, South Pole, it would drop it straight down. If you were to stand right on the equator line of the earth and drop it, it would fall straight down. But basically anywhere else on the planet, it's going to curve because it has to. It's following the gradient of the pressure set up by the mass. There are elements preceding hydrogen, and we really need to consider those not as an ether, but empty space. Science doesn't really have a good concept right now of what empty space is. I remember watching a documentary on PBS a few years ago about interviewing all these physicists on what space really is, and there's all these hypotheses that it's a fabric or something like a space-time matrix that can bend and warp and all these things. But really, Walter's telling us, well, there's elements, full-tone elements preceding hydrogen, and they follow the same structure of the octave wave. So we really only need to understand octave waves and understand that those octave waves are within other octave waves. This is going to get us much closer to what the actual situation is. So now I need to point out that, the Rutherford-Bohr model is a 3-dimensional structure. But Walter tells us something important, that nature doesn't really begin as a 3-dimensional product right from the start. It actually is non-dimensional, you could say, if it's just mind. But it's first 2-dimensional because it's made up of single plane units which are in themselves 2-dimensional, kind of like, like cutting a piece of film out of a film strip. It's just a flat plane, but you project or stack those planes along a new axis now. So I've shown here that the mind center extends to 3 centers. And this creates the bilateral mass. Does everybody see that? If you were to stack these, and they were smaller diameters, then you would get a cone, and then you would get a cone in the other way as well. And so you really only get a 3-dimensional universe because of the polarization. This plane is polarized and extended in 2 different directions, and that's how the 3rd dimension pops out of the 2nd. I don't consider time a dimension as such because time is really just a marcation of the intervals. So in essence, if God never ceases to think, then waves will continue. They will repeat themselves, and thus time will always be measuring those repetition sequences. So I don't really consider it like in some Einstein different theories, they say, space and time are like sort of intertwined. And in my mind, not so much, because time is part and parcel of the wave. So so getting back, so the moment that the 2-dimensional units are divided into pairs and unite to become the mass, that's when the 3D universe really appears. That's what I want to point out there. Preceding that is just 2-dimension. So the mind image is the thought. The body image are the actions, and the actions are always in pairs. The thought concepts are two-dimensional, but the actions are polarized extensions, as I said, so the actions are necessarily three-dimensional. You can see that here, that we begin two-dimensional cathode plane, but by the time we reach the amplitude carbon, we have a fully formed bilateral spherical mass. So we started with a flat plane and we end up with a three-dimensional object. And this is essentially what we see when we look out into the universe. We see solid mass surrounded by space. So this is Walter showing us a lot of the invisibility of the structure of integration of mass out of space. We're quite familiar in our science with the dissolution of matter back into empty space, which is sort of the explosion-based concept behind a lot of our technology, such as the internal combustion engine. Real quick, I just wanted to point out here, for those who aren't familiar with some of the terms Walter uses describing orbits, we have perihelia, which is the point in the orbit when the planet is nearest to its central primary, for example, the sun. And the aphelia is the point in the orbit of a celestial body at which it is the farthest from the primary. And one thing I want to point out about this is in New Concept, Walter tells us there's a really big hole in Newtonian physics where his gravity basically says mass attracts other mass, right? But there's a part in the orbit where a planet goes around that actually accelerates toward this point in space when it reaches its aphelia. And that acceleration has no mass there to attract it to that point. So it's a pretty big gaping hole in Newtonian mechanics because there's no mass there to attract the body. And yet there is an acceleration that occurs. So it can't be mass attracts other mass. There's a big gaping hole right there in Newtonian physics. So this image, for those of you who have studied the home study course, you'll be quite familiar with this. The Russells use this image to sort of say, you know, this is the most important. I won't read this whole thing to you, but they basically tell you this is the greatest advance to science that the world has ever known, just through the magnification of an atom 2,700,000 times, bringing it into the range of your eye to see. They say this makes it possible to look directly at God and thereby prove that there is naught but light, again, optical universe, in all the universe. That light, which is God, is invisible and inert when it's cold, but it becomes visible only when being compressed and brought within our range of visibility. So Walter goes on to say, well, now that we have this image, you know, he said this is the key for electronic people to, you know, computers, radar engineers, they can vastly improve their instruments. He also tells us, hey, you'll be able to get transmutation now from looking at this. Its incalculable value is proving the division of the spectrum and the equality of pairs of opposition. And fire and water, now that's something I wanted to touch on. They're the only products. So again, this is like, it's ways of saying the same thing: cold and heat, wet and dryness. So really, you could break it down to the universe is really just water and fire. Buddy mentioned something the other day about electricity being water, and I think that's 100% correct and a massive insight. Electricity really is just water as far as we're concerned with on this planet here. So we have to talk about Erwin Mueller. And this is what I wanted to touch on at Tesla Tech and I didn't get to. But this guy, this image right here was taken via a device called a field ion microscope, and it was invented by Erwin Wilhelm Mueller. German scientist, worked at Pennsylvania State to develop the world's first field ion microscope, which allowed us to take these fantastic pictures that the Russells speak so highly of. It's all due to this man right here. And we're going to look, I got a lot of images that he produced to sort of drive the point home. But does anybody notice when you look at this, does anybody see a material nucleus? Here, or here, or here, or here, or here, or here, anywhere. There isn't one. The photo speaks volumes because the day that this was published in the scientific community should have been the day they realized that there is no solid nucleus and that a solid nucleus theory would have to go into the garbage can and we would have to start over. All these images I'm going to show you of this type of stuff comes from this book, published in the 60s, Field Ion Microscopy, Principles and Application. Author's Erwin Mueller. He is the guy that did all this work. So, is this proof of Russell's atom? Well, Walter said there's mind at the center of every atom. And we can't see mind. We can only see the absence of it. And so the absence of a solid nucleus here tells us exactly that Walter is correct. And I'm sure you've all seen these images in the adjacent room. Looks pretty similar to me. I don't know what you guys think. Walter's just showing us as the rings expand outward, they compress toward the edge. As the convexity flips to concavity, the opposite effect. So it's when I say wave interferences, I mean if you have a wave coming outward and a wave coming inward, when the two meet and collide, that is when these interference patterns are produced. That's all it is. And this is, I'll show you how the field ion microscope works, but this is solid, it's platinum. The ones here I showed you before, these are tungsten, but this one here is platinum metal. This is a solid metal, but if you were able to get your eye to be able to see it, zoom in that many times to this resolution on the atomic scale, this is all you would see it is. Just empty space with electrical potential rings around it. So again, it's just, Walter's just shown us, it's all just rings. The interference patterns of rings. That's all that solid material is. So let's look at how the field ion microscope works. This is right from the book, the first section on what it is. Anybody familiar with a cathode ray tube or it's a bit antiquated technology now, but it essentially functions just like a cathode ray tube. There's a specimen right here, which is your tip of platinum or tip of tungsten, and you would know if you were able to take a needle that can actually puncture your skin and break your skin, if you were to zoom in on it far enough, you would see that it's actually rounded. If you were to zoom in far enough, does everybody get that? So even something that we think is a point or a sharp object is actually rounded or curved if you were to zoom in far enough with enough resolution. So essentially how you do this is you apply high voltage from 5 to 30,000 volts, and you fill this, you evacuate it. So you see there's a vacuum pump here. You evacuate all the air out of here, and you add in basically an inert gas, such as helium or argon. And most of Erwin Mueller's work, he was using helium, and you'll see that in some of the descriptions here. But this is basically how it works. They call this ionization, but you basically just put high voltage into this needle, and you ground your screen, which is fluorescently coated, and now the image. Does everybody see the cone? The cone here? You start from a point, right, this is zoomed in right here, but you expand that image and you bring it within the realm that you can see it now, because you can't get your eyes to really see something that's this small, but you can if you project it like we project light from this projector onto this flat screen here. It's the exact same principle. So this is what allowed Erwin Mueller to image the atom for the very first time, and we owe him a lot for doing this. So here's, this is iridium, and it's helium again. So it's helium inside the field ion microscope, and this is iridium tip sample that projects this image. So you all see that, you know, this is a different metal, so it's got a different structure, like a snowflake. It's got a different pattern. And then we go to iridium, and, you know, we see a different structure yet again. So this tells us that, you know, it's a way to image the atom, but it's also a way to peer into the geometry or the structure of the individual elements. It's telling us that, you know, there's a difference of structure, therefore there's a difference of the geometry. And I just want to invite you to consider two similar ways of producing this type of geometry effect. One is a kaleidoscope, which, you know, is about as simple as it gets. It's just 3 orthogonal mirrors with little bits of glass in there. But you turn it, you add dynamism to it, and you generate new structure, new form, new patterns. And isn't that exactly what you're seeing here? You change the element that you're imaging, and then the structure changes that you see. And the other thing I want to point out is the mirror cubes, which, if you haven't looked into, I highly recommend it. But you'll see again this sort of pinpoints with empty space between them, exactly the same type of thing again. And also water crystals. Look at all the different hexagonal structures of water, and they look just like this. So maybe what we consider solid metal is actually just water. So, we got any more proof? Well, in 2013, there was a paper in the Physical Review called Hydrogen Atoms Under Magnification: Direct Observation of the Nodal Structure of Stark States. That's a lot of quantum nonsense right there, but basically all they did is they did the field ion microscope in a slightly different way, but they actually looked at the actual wave function of a hydrogen atom. There's the image. Again, this was published in 2013. Walter Russell drew this diagram in 1959. Looks pretty much like the same thing to me. So let's talk about the quantum theory. They claim that, you know, energy is within matter. This is kind of where they go wrong right at the start. They also say that it exists in certain packets or bundles. It doesn't really have any relation to what nature's doing anywhere, nor does it really work with polarity, which is creating everything, nor does it really fit in with the electrical wave, which Walter tells us the octave wave creates everything. So it doesn't really fit in with that, so it can't really be all that correct. The only cause of any vibration whatsoever is polarity. And a great analogy I was just discussing is a Mexican wave. When people stand up and sit down, if you do it in the right sequence, it appears as though a wave is traveling from left to right all the way around a stadium. But the people are only standing up and sitting down, which means they're only moving up and down vertically, yet we see a wave move left to right. So if a wave field is polarized and then depolarized and then polarized and then depolarized in the neighboring wave field, it will appear as though the wave traveled from here to there. Does everybody understand that? So polarity is the only cause of the vibration, any vibration anywhere in the universe. So if that's the only way we can get those interchanges is between those two opposites of polarity, which extend from that zero fulcrum. See, again, because you can't ever extend away from that fulcrum zero without giving back to it. We're all hitched to the same gravity shafts, so to speak. And sequences of reversal. So the destination points between which motion oscillates in sequences of reversals. That's very important. Again, that goes back to time. Without sequences of reversal, there is no oscillation. If there's no oscillation, there is no time by which that oscillation is expressed. So that right there kind of just like whoosh, pulls the rug out from quantum theory. The beauty of Walter's work is he goes right to the crux of you don't have to mess around with theory and oh, maybe it's this, and then maybe I'll invent something. It's just like he's like, look, you got to go back to the God light, because that's where everything starts and ends, to begin again. So particle-wave duality, basically, we're going back in time to some of these early experiments in quantum theory, and they were saying, well, we got this photoelectric effect where we think these charged particles are coming off when light hits it. So we think light is a particle. And then they did these, double slit experiments and different things, and the Davison-Germer experiment, and they showed that, well, maybe it's actually showing like it's more like a wave. So, there's this problem in physics. Is it a particle or is it a wave? I mean, it appears to us as in two different experiments that it's doing both. But Walter tells us again, if nothing else, just for this one sentence, you should buy this book. But he says, look, the basis of this explanation rests upon the fact that the wave belongs in its entirety to the zero of gravity, while corpuscular matter actually is only in the realm of electrical motion. So every octave wave is a gravity shaft, like I said, around which the matter spins. So it's really waves, in my opinion. It's all waves, even though we have things that we could say have mass and charges and things that are like corpuscular or particle matter. But that matter cannot exist without the zero of the gravity, which is the wave that it's hitched to. So if there's no waves in this universe, there are no particles. Does that make sense? So we're going to talk now about valence, moving into some chemistry here. Walter says about the valence that our chemists and our physicists, they've recognized something of the mathematical orderliness of different atoms, and they call it valence. So in going back to the Rutherford-Bohr concept of electron shells, you would see that different orbitals, have different numbers associated with them, and that's the root behind bonding. So, for example, if you had oxygen, it has a valence of two rings. But in the Bohr-Rutherford model, it's it's the number of electrons in the orbital. In chemistry, this is how we work out how we can bond certain elements together to form compounds. You have to balance the valence so that you have a total of 8 electrons in one valence shell. And I think 8's an interesting number. They call it an octet. The inert gases have an octet in their valence shell in the other theory. But in reality, the elements are projected from the inert gases, so the inert gases don't really contain any electrons whatsoever. And they've always done this in chemistry, but they don't really know why. And that's the thing I want to drive home here, is that they don't really understand the true nature of valence, because the valence, again, if we're just dealing with rings as our particles around vacuum, then the helium would be our 4 rings, because there's no more space for them to bond with anything, because they aren't really technically elements. They're the very beginning or the seed of the elements. And then when we project the first Locke potential, lithium and fluoride, for example, we have 1 ring centering the whole, but it's a smaller ring than helium, because it's a projection from it, and so it's beginning to compress the empty space of this hole tighter and tighter. Oxygen and beryllium have 2 rings, still smaller hole. Nitrogen and boron, 3 rings, and the whole is very compressedly tight now as the centripetal motion increases. Finally, we get to carbon, which is, as I show you, the rings stacked bilaterally form your spherical mass. And carbon would have then, therefore, a valence of 4. Spinning rings, which get closer to their mind centers, however, in the mind nucleus, what he calls the mind nucleus of every atom, they gain more and more power in the ratio that they get closer to that hole. And I have another diagram that shows that and explains that a little bit better. But that's basically the whole concept right there in that image of the true nature of what valence actually means. It has nothing to do with electrons in orbitals. Couldn't be farther from the truth. So this is the image I was talking about. That you see, as you get tighter and tighter to the energy source, which is that still point, your density increases and your heat increases as well. So Walter's showing us that this is the direction of compression. This is the direction of expansion, which lowers the potential. So you can think of this as a dynamic thing. It's moving as a cone toward this point, and then it moves back to that point. So the real reason that these rings, which are spinning, get closer to their mind center, the mind nucleus of every atom, they gain more and more power in the ratio of that closeness. So that's why when the whole is almost entirely squeezed out of a carbon sun, we know that we get an enormous amount of heat generated from that sun because of this compression and tightening closer and closer to that still point. But I want to point out that stillness is always there, even in a carbon sun. It centers the very middle of it in every plane of every ring. And that's how we express heat and power in this universe, is by tightening in ever-closing spiral rings closer to that point, never really truly completely doing that, even in a carbon sun, but that's about as far as you can go with it. Electrical engineers wanted to point out, they've known for a long time that the electrical current, it doesn't flow in the center. It's always around the circumference of the conductor, and they call that the skin effect. It's always on the outside. So if you were to actually get the current to run through the center, you would basically take the solid conductor back to a gas almost instantaneously. And Walter did that experiment with a tungsten wire. He had it inside of a vacuum tube and basically electrocuted that piece of tungsten wire so quickly that it was gone. The mass was completely gone, and what was left as a residual in that tube was helium. So the question really is where did the helium come from? And it was there all along, because again, the inert gases, that's where you begin from. So when the mass explodes, the only thing that's left is the seed of what generated it. So I want to point out too that there's this process that Walter describes of inside out and outside in turning, and this happens in all wave cycles. When it's doing this, the blue side of the spectrum is within, and the red end is on the outside. When the holes are closed, though, when you get here, the red, white hot end is actually the center now, and then the blue surrounds it, just like we have blue skies around our planet. If you were to go down into the earth, you would see that it's red. And we know that because, we have volcanoes and stuff, and it comes out red, doesn't it? So, bonding. Now, this is something I thought a lot about when I read New Concept of the Universe the first time. I sort of found something lacking in Walter's writings about specifically covalent and ionic bonding, because in chemistry, the way they teach it now, it's, they say, well, covalent bonding is, you have an atom here and an atom here, and they're going to share these electrons, and that's what's going to keep them paired up and keep them close together. And then you have ionic bonding, which is like slightly different and only occurs sometimes, where you have this electron just pops right over and is just given to this one, and then this guy's Now you have two electrostatic forces that are polarized, and so it's going to pull them together by Coulomb's law. The only problem is there are no electrons to share or to pop off and get. You ever seen a moon just jump from Saturn and go over to Mercury or something? No, I don't think so. So, really the question becomes is in Walter's science, well, we know bonding occurs. We know we can mix different atoms together and we'll end up with molecules and different compounds. But what's the driving force behind keeping them together? Because it can't be this. It has to be an optical effect, or at the very least an electrical effect that doesn't necessarily agree with the Coulomb law. So let's get into what it really actually is. It's an optical universe. It's light. So all atoms which are generating, that is to say integrating, toward their maturity are in fact biconvex lenses, such as you see here, or here and here. And you'll see great examples of it in Walter's charts in the adjacent room as well. Those that are radiating, however, into the cold beginnings, which is depolarizing or degenerating, are in fact biconcave lenses. And that makes sense because you just simply reverse the curvature, don't you? And that is why the universe is entirely optical, because the atoms themselves are just interference patterns, which is to say curvature. That curvature reverses the same way the wave reverses from generating to depolarizing. So, and he's also pointing out here that a biconvex lens centering the equator of a sphere produces what he called the gravity field, and the gravity field is another name for, in physics, the magnetic field. But Walter tells us that there aren't really such things as magnetic fields, because there are really only electrical fields that are bound by magnetic planes of zero curvature. So a magnetic field doesn't really exist in our universe. It's really a gravitational field of radiation from a compressed mass when it's reversed and depolarizing. That's really important. I can't stress that enough. More examples of optics. You can make a sphere using convex lenses and concave lenses, like he's showing here. And I want to point out something too. This is really important quote in Atomic Suicide. Walter describes at one point, he says these vortices, it's kind of hard to imagine how you get this bicone shape of apices coming together and then becoming a base and winding so that your apices are going like this now. And you always see this in Walter's drawings of these nested spiral cones within one another. But it's not really all that clear, like, well, how does it actually spin, and when they meet, what happens, and all this. But he gives us this hint right here, and I just think it's so important. He says, just imagine that those two apices of those cones, they meet to create one center of gravity, and that's what you've achieved in a perfect sphere in a flaming carbon sun. But as the wave progresses, they push through each other until they bore a hole right through the compressed sphere. And you can see this, he's drawing this beautifully. Do you see how they meet at this point, but then they push through so that this apex now is over here, and this apex here is over here, and they continue to push through each other. And as they do, that hole in the middle there widens up and becomes a larger and larger area. This is the hallmark of a depolarizing, degenerating mass, and I'll show you some examples of that with pictures. But that's such an important statement right there. I think people who've been studying Walter's work for a very long time, they could take this description now and go back and study it, and you might get a little bit more from what he's saying now. And I want to show, this is a great image, but I think Walter was cheeky. He just put, he put this thing up here. And isn't that this again right here? So as those two cones push through each other, you open up that ring. in the center. And that's just like the Lyra Nebula. I'll show you a picture of the Lyra Nebula that shows that very clearly. And as it does this, the colors reverse. So if you have red on the inside, now you have blue on the inside with red on the outside. And I'll show you an example of that. But I have this image over here again, just to even make this even more clear. You start with one single point of gravity, and that's omnipresent anywhere in the universe. You divide that into two centers, which is, a division of gravity, and it's low potential at this point. But as you start to centripetally wind from those two toward each other, you extend that cone out from both sides, and they eventually meet, but they just keep going right through, and they never change direction. That's really important. Nature seems to reverse direction, but it never does. It's always going in the same direction. So an example of this is, if you were to stand above the Earth and look down on it from the North Pole, you would see it's turning counterclockwise. But if you were to go down underneath and look at the South Pole, you'd see it's turning clockwise. But if you were to look at it from the equator, you would see it turning one of those ways. Let's just say counterclockwise. So the way I work this out is I realized that we have two eyes. So when you bring both your eyes above in one hemisphere, you only see one direction. And then when you bring your two eyes down underneath, you only see one direction. But it seems to be the opposite. It's a bit of a hard one to wrap your head around, but it never changes directions because they simply just push through each other. And that's what opens up the hole in the mass so that it can radiate outwards now. And so they push through and they start to depolarize the mass without changing direction. That's really, really important. So now I want to talk about, because this works right into another researcher in magnetics, Edward Leedskalnin, who you might know from his Coral Castle in Florida. Yeah, and if you read his book, Magnetic Current, you'll see in there he has about 55 or so experiments to do with permanent magnets or electromagnetism. But he has a completely different theory as to what's going on and how it works that he pieced together all these years of playing with magnets and different things. And he is essentially describing, if I can just label it something, he's describing essentially a double helical magnetic interaction. So there's, what you can see here is a red coil spiraling around, and then there's an interpenetrating blue spiral going in the opposite direction. And this is his model of direct current. So this is really cool because electrical understanding right now, there's a totally different understanding of what electricity is when it's flowing through a conductor. But Ed Leedskalnin's telling us, and you can prove it with his experiments in his book, that there actually has to at least be two flows to have current flowing through a wire, at least two. Now, if we take it, what Walter's telling us even further, there has to be 8 flows because there are 4 pairs in every octave. So and this is what I do, I think about this all the time when I'm engineering. This is really the crux behind next level electrical engineering, is being able to view these vortices and these spiral dynamics and to actually engineer them to do something that we want them to do instead of just wasting power. I want to point out this, you don't have to look at all of this. I mean, you can, it's great, isn't it? Isn't it wonderful? There's so much information here, it's mind-boggling. But I want to point out this wave cycle that Walter draws you here, down here on the bottom. Do you see how it's the exact same thing as Ed Leedskalnin describes? You have a red wave form, and you have an interpenetrating blue waveform. And at 180 degrees relative to this axis is the exact opposite. And that's electricity, folks, right there. So now we're going to talk about some colors and different things. But I have a really special piece of information here. So I'm at the university here. I'm also sort of the archivist, and I just have looked through a lot of different things in the archives. I've read the home study course, first edition, the second edition, the third edition, the fourth edition, and the editions in between when they were, working on them. And while I was going through all this stuff, I found an explanation as to why the Russells sometimes refer to the red and the blue or the red and the green. And has anybody noticed this studying the Russell material over the years, that sometimes it's red and green, sometimes it's red and blue? And I wondered about this myself, and I found this little excerpt here that they were writing that it exactly explains, they say, why we refer to the spectrum, the color spectrum, as the red side and the green side. And they also explain why it's the red and the blue. So I'm just going to read this, and you can use this image right here, because you see we have a blue pole and a red pole, but we also have this image here which you can use. You see you have the red side and the blue side, but the thing is all colors come out of black or invisibility, but it comes out of the blue. I think this is where that phrase comes from. Oh, it came to me out of the blue. Well, all the colors in the rainbow come out of the blue because our sky is in fact blue. So I'm going to read this, and it'll kind of dynamically explain this image and also this image right here, which is really, you can see that's kind of the same thing, right? It's the same as the optical lenses that I showed before, but it's just colorized. Walter put the colors in there. So he says the octave spectrum is divided into 4 pairs, or sex mates. Each mate of each pair is on the opposite side of the divided zero line of the wave, which acts as the fulcrum of its oscillating interchanging between its mate pairs. This diagram below gives not only the relative position of each pair, but their relative proportions of volume. As blue is the first evidence of heat and light which emerges from the black cold of space, it occupies more space than the others. On one side of the dividing fulcrum is the indigo blue of the green side of the spectrum. And on the other side is the blue violet of the red side, here. The next pair are pure blue on the indigo side, which means that more light and heat have been added to the indigo blue. And on the other side is violet, which means that more heat and light have come into the red side, with their consequent reductions of volume due to increased compression. Continued compression of the blue side gives the green, which precedes the yellow of the yellow pair. Again, the pair is the double yellows. And the pure red on the other side, which precedes the orange or the yellow-red of the yellow pair. The final colors of the greatest heat and light of compression are the 2 yellows which precede the white heat of the spectrum ending and its radioactive dissolution. If you study this diagram, you will readily understand that if we describe the 2 halves as the red and the blue sides of the spectrum, which is literally true, it could be confusing, for both sides spring from the blue pair. Does everybody see that? If they both come out of blue, it's kind of hard to say, well, it's red and it is literally red and blue, but it's almost more accurate to describe it to somebody as red and green. So it is better, therefore, to describe them as the red side and the green side, for the green is not in evidence on the red side at all, nor is red in evidence on the green side. Bear in mind, however, that red and blue are true mates, for they are the only unmixed pair in the whole spectrum. This pair are constantly interchanging to manifest the life-death principle in cycles, in which the pure blue of the cold sky surrounds the hot red of centering matter, and the hot red expands in rings to surround the blue and green centers of the extending rings. Bear in mind also that the blue of the spectrum is the mother womb, and the red is the father seed, which penetrates the womb to create father and mother bodies, which again expand to recenter the blue of this universe womb, of the universal womb, to complete the 2 halves of the cycle of life. That's never been released, that piece of information, and I think it serves to clarify why the Russells, chose sometimes red and green as an explanation over the red and blue. But the red and blue is literally true because they're balanced mates. Here we have some examples. This is M57, the Lyra Nebula. They call it the Ring Nebula. Does everybody see what color is it in the middle here? Blue. And what's it on the outside? Red. So can you tell what phase of the wave that this, well, it's a nebula, so you already know it was a compressed sun that exploded. So the reversal of color occurred, where now blue is at the center and red is on the outside. When it was a compressed sun, the red was centering and the blue was on the outside. This is how it literally appears in terms of the colors that, if you could see them, this shift occurs from the inside to the outside. Again, it goes back to Walter's description of an inside out, outside in. If you have colors, if you have blue on the outside like we have on Earth, if we were to explode the Earth and expand it outwards, you would find that the blue would have to be on the center, and the red would be on the outside because the wavefront is moving outward from a center. So these are just some more of my, summations or drawings of what I think Walter is describing. He uses these terms prolation and oblation quite a bit in a new concept. General active means that the poles, these 2 points here, are coming closer together in the north-south polarity, as the east-west does the opposite. In the other, it expands. They push apart. So east-west draw closer together as the north-south extend away from that center. The east-west extend away from that center of gravity as depolarization draws the north and the south closer together. So these are the dynamics of the spheroids on every portion of the wave. And there's an image in Universal 1 that kind of looks like this, but I sort of wanted to redraw it again in my interpretation. I think I already covered this, so we'll just skip past that. Carbon has an equator, just one. That makes it unique. All elements which are not on the wave amplitude are disunited pairs, which means that they basically have an equator themselves, they have an equator in their mate, and they also have a dividing equator in the middle here. So there are 3 equators to factor in if you're dealing with an element that is not on wave amplitude. There's only 2 nonmetals, which is carbon and silicon. All the rest of them are metals, even something like chlorine, which is a gas. Technically, in Russell science, it is a metal. Everybody knows that when we have a solid sphere carbon, that it's got a perfect cube around it, bounding it. So that's why I just draw this cube here right on the carbon line, because this is the only time you see a cube is when you take, for instance, lithium and fluorine as 2 mates that are divided. If you unite them now, that you would have a cubic crystal, perfectly cubic crystal. But if you were to take beryllium and fluorine, for example, you would have a distorted crystal. It would not be perfectly cubic. That's a really big subject, and I'm probably going to have to do a whole nother lecture just on that, because it goes into some crazy geometry and something called the E8 Lie group, which is a fantastically complicated mathematical form, but really cool. So this is something I wanted to show. This is the first time I've ever released this image. Walter says this. He says, by dividing the entire 9-octave cycle into 2 opposite half cycles, one half is general active, the other half being equally radioactive, a comprehensive base for transmutation will replace the present concept of dislodging electrons or adding electrons to them to transmute one element into the other. This is the old concept of if I could take an electron out of lead, I would have gold, and so on and so forth. But Walter kind of whimsically says, well, if I took a leg off a man, would he turn into a horse? Sorry. Doesn't happen that way. So he's actually giving us a real base for transmutation by telling us to do this. So what I did is I took the entire 9-octave chart And I placed it in such a way to make my own new chart where the entire 9 octaves is in 1 octave. That's pretty cool, I think, because it works. It still fits. You have your inert gases here. Here's alphanon, which is the very first inert gas, and we have niton. So this is our fixed peg of our guitar string that doesn't move, and these are our inert gases. And then you can put the inert gases in between the lock potential positions, and you still get the amplitude elements appearing right where they ought to in between the gases, with carbon, of course, always being the midline. So carbon completely divides the entire 9-octave chart in half. Everything preceding carbon is generoactive. Everything after carbon is radioactive. So this gives you an entirely new way to look at the entire chart and where a particular element is within that wave cycle. So now I also put this dotted line here. Does everybody see that dotted line? I say here invisible space octave. So this also gives you literal understanding of how much of the universe is completely invisible to us. Everything before this line right here, which is hydrogen, is completely invisible. And visible matter only begins right here and extends outward. And I also want to point out that everything before this line in the middle is red interpenetrating the blue. Everything after this line is the blue interpenetrating the red. So this chart has an enormous amount of information in it, and it's a summation of a lot of different charts of Walter's all in one to give you a completely new understanding. This is sort of my gift to all of you, along with everything else I've said. So I also want to point out that Walter tells us that, within considering carbon, for example, he says carbon as a spherical mass is such a small volume compared to the volume of its wave field, which is many millions of times larger. So he says it's like having a pea inside of a gymnasium auditorium would be the relative ratio of empty space at the wave field around a solid carbon sun, which is massive if you take that to a stellar scale. It's almost more than we can really imagine as human beings. But this is all gaseous around it. It's only solidified at the center there where 6 tetrahedrons meet, or 8 diagonals. Now, do we have any proof that this is an optical universe? I don't know, go outside sometime. Double rainbows, Swannanoa is the most incredible place to see double rainbows. It happens there all the time. It's part of the magic of that place. I've seen them quite a few times. Sundogs, Buddy had the same image, but I like that. It's good proof that it's an optical universe. Or at the very least that we have an atmosphere here of oxygen, nitrogen that basically acts like an optical lens. It does the exact same thing that a camera does, or your eyes do. Does everybody realize that your eyes are curved? So you have curvature. So if you see a straight line, is that line really straight? No, because it's curved when it goes into the curvature of the lenses in your eye. There are no straight lines. If there was a straight line, it would be a magnetic plane of zero curvature, which reverses curvature just like a mirror does. Now, I was looking at this image, because I always like to end with like physical experiments I've done just to show you that like this isn't, I've actually investigated the physical, how this actually works out. And Walter has this drawing. These are part of the drawings Matt released in 2015 on the Facebook. And these were sort of like unreleased drawings from Walter, from 1954 in particular, this one is. And what he's showing here is a conical magnet. And again, I just want to reiterate my whole purpose for the last 3 years in giving these talks is trying to convince people that magnetism is optics, or magnetic fields are really just the effect of optical curvature. So Walter shows us this bar magnet that is a cone, and he's showing us if we were to take iron filings and put it on the base of this cone, they would all, does everybody see where they would be? On the outer edge, right? And that makes sense because that's where the red would be, or the compression, the outward expansion is all on that outer rim there. But if we go to the opposite end of the magnet, which is a compressed apex, that all the iron filings would gather together in a little ball right there, compressed to a point. But the amount of material is the same on each one. It'll do the same amount of work, but one's expanded and one's contracted. So then he also shows us, do you see here it's south and south with north in the middle? So what I'm going to actually show you now is that this image from 1954 that Walter drew is actually literally true, because I built it and it does it. So do you see this is the compressed end? Does that look just like what that is? Okay, 1954 is when this was made. I did this experiment in 2016. So let's look at the other end. Where are all the iron filings? And this is just what I made here is a steel cone with copper coil around it. So I made a solenoid or an electromagnet, and I just applied DC power to the turns of the coil to magnetize the steel. But then I could turn the current off and all the iron filings would just fall right down, which is really great, because in a permanent magnet, you can't shut the field off to get your iron filings off, and they just stay there. So, and you have to sit there and pick them all off. It's a nightmare. Duct tape works really well, I figured out. But now I want to show you, well, okay, so he's also shown us if we take two cones and we put them apex to apex, that we create a compressed mass, a sphere. And this is iron filings suspended in midair via the two cones being energized via the DC current. So that works out too. Now, let me take you back here just real quick. Does everybody see it's a double north, it's two norths in the middle, and that there's an extended equator moving outward? Well, I did that too, and it works. I put North Pole magnet on the base of this cone. I put North Pole magnet on the base of that cone. So I had two south poles on the opposite side, just like Walter says. And I have two north poles in the middle here, which the Coulomb law says they should repel. They do not, however, because there is no attraction or repulsion in the universe. But what you find is that you can extend outward on this equator quite a long distance, and these washers will be completely suspended in midair, just like I'm showing. There's another view. So I'm not even putting power into these. I'm using permanent magnets to do this. And again, the Gauss here is much higher than at the base. I verified that with magnetic flux density measurements. There's another view. You can really see it. Does everybody see that there's nothing holding those there except just the touching of that washer there. They extend outwards. So if I had a different piece of steel or a larger washer or something, I could probably do all kinds of different shapes with this. Now, I've never released this image before, but this was. So once I had played with the cones long enough, I was studying Tesla, and I had some ideas about what can you do with this if you use this as a transformer core. So I rigged up, you see I used blue and red wire so I didn't mix them up, because if you wind two parallel wires next to each other that are the same color, it's hard to figure out which one's which. So I used blue and the red, but you can see very clearly what I did is I just wound them in bifilar is the term, bifilar winding. And I connected alternating current to this blue wire and that red wire, and then the neutral of the AC was connected to that blue wire and that red wire, and I've shorted the two unused windings together there and there. So what I did was I put power through these coils to light this light bulb. And guess what? I got light, and what do I have here? Compression that suspends iron filings. So what this means is that I'm doing double the amount of work. I'm doing the power of the current to run this bulb, which is a load. And I'm also have here in the center, I've created a new form of energy in addition to that load. Does everybody see that? Because I can put something here to turn this into more power, either with like a rotational motor type of thing, or Walter used a turbine to produce. He produced massive amounts of heat here. But you see what I did is all I'm doing is I'm rewinding the electricity back up before I use it. Multiply before you divide, or divide before you multiply. It's a two-way universe. So this image here is the solution to this image. It's literally the meaning. I'm giving it to you. You wind the coil and you use it to run a load, and then the power that you get here in the middle is above and beyond unity. It's more than what you put in to run this load. And Walter gave this diagram out in the home study course. But this is the build, and this is the principle to show you that it's real and that it works. And just as a final proof with magnets, because I love magnets, I took a ring magnet, I sandwiched washers in between, and you sit it on a device called a ferrocell, and it allows you to image the magnetic field, which is invisible to us. And you see these curvature patterns. But again, to reinforce the point a million times, there's nothing in the center. It's a whole. It's mind. It's nothing, but it's everything. Does that make sense? It's not physically there, but it's everything. It's power, it's God, it's love, it's everything. It's mind. It's hollow. And with that, please go to my page here. There's a donate button if you would like to support our research. I would really appreciate it. And with that, I will conclude.